I'm with Manish Sabharwal, Vice Chairman of TeamLease Services. He just stepped down as chairman only a month ago, one of India's largest employers. And today we're talking about the condition of India's economy. We've just had Nirmala Sitharaman, the finance minister, has just presented the budget a few days ago. But let's look at the broader state of the economy with disinvestment. Air India has already been put on the block, perhaps LIC too. But Manish Sabharwal, first, let me welcome you to The Print. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Jyoti.
So you're in your wonderful home in Bangalore. I can see the sun pouring in, and there's this sort of gorgeous paradise sort of scene that we have in front of us. But the Indian economy isn't looking as great. In fact, 2 years ago, let me just remind you, Mr. Sabharwal, when I interviewed you, and you said a couple of very interesting things. And one of the things that stayed with me is that you said the pain after COVID will be nothing like what we have seen before. So perhaps if you can contextualize 2 years down the line, India's been through this horrific trauma of COVID. How do you look at things today?
Well, I think, the tale of two cities started with it was the best of times and the worst of times. I think that COVID has in some ways been really good for the Indian IT industry. It's been really good for digitization. It's been really good for many aspects of the Indian economy. It obviously has been very difficult for many parts of the Indian economy and society, right? I mean, I think, but wherever it has been difficult were pre-existing conditions or comorbidities. So I don't think COVID created anything new on the downside. It created a lot of new upsides. I don't think we would be doing 5 billion transactions on UPI a month if COVID hadn't happened. I don't think our IT employment would be going from 5 million to 10 million. This year, India will export more software than Saudi Arabia will oil. Now, you have to think about that. Nobody in the world would predict that a country with $2,500 per capita income would be exporting $180 billion of software. So that is because of COVID. Now there's no such thing as a technology company. Every company is a technology company. We're talking about technology in education, technology in retail. So I think the best of times is the upsides on digitization. 50% of India's foreign direct investment since 1991 has come in the last 5 years. Last year, our private equity investment was $77 billion. 5 years ago, that was 10 billion. Last year, our IPOs collected 1.25 lakh crores. 5 years ago, that was 5,000 crores. So I just wanted to frame it as be careful with, it's agony and ecstasy. It's the best of times and it's the worst of times. I mean, you have to recognize that India is the only country in the world with 20 years of growth ahead of us, high growth. Large country. And I think the world is recognizing that. COVID has made that obvious to people. So from a capital market perspective, from being an entrepreneur's perspective, every 10 days a unicorn was created last year. But out of the 77 billion, what is more important is 44 billion went to venture capital, which is early stage, first generation entrepreneurs. People like us, my parents were civil servants. We couldn't have started our companies without private equity or venture capital. Banks never give us money. Right. And this is a 5-year, 7-year phenomena max. But in the last 1 year, it's just gone on overdrive. So the upside is that COVID has reinforced India's software brand. COVID has reinforced India's capital market brand as an investment destination. Obviously, the downside is that there is distress in the informal sector. I think we had a priority to formalize the informal sector. I think GST had already begun that process. I think, but COVID was an exogenous, it's a civilizational sort of cataclysm, which obviously on the upside accelerated stuff, but has hurt the most vulnerable. I think we have raised our government spending from 24 lakh crores to 34 lakh crores to 39 lakh crores this year. So I think most people who at the beginning of COVID were saying, well, you're doing conjuicy, fiscal policy needs to, forget about public debt to GDP ratio. I think we've had to balance, stealing from our grandchildren, but obviously spending money right now.
Okay.
But you have to be clear that the pain that is there in the Indian economy, fiscal fiscal and monetary policy can only do so far. It's only structural reform that is going to fix it.
Okay, so let's talk about all these issues, Mr. Sabharwal. The first thing you said is, the best of times and the worst of times, right? The agony and ecstasy of India these last couple of years. I mean, these really sort of encapsulates the essence of what we've been going through. Now, you've talked about the ecstasy. For a minute, if you could talk a little bit about the agony. I mean, you do employ lakhs of workers. And if you look at the informal side of unemployment, let's talk a little bit about that. What has been your experience of people? Have they needed reskilling or upskilling, or have they or has a big hole opened up in the heart of India and people have fallen through it?
Well, reskilling is not a medical condition; it's a human condition. Everybody in India needs reskilling all the time, and I think that is what we did not recognize for decades before the pandemic showed up. You want a guarantee, you buy a toaster. There are no guarantees in life. All of us every 3 years, 5 years will have to reskill ourselves. And most importantly, I think COVID has reinforced that even companies are not permanent, right? The average life expectancy of a Fortune 500 company is now 14 years. So the average life expectancy of most employers in India is much less than that. So, we walk around with this notion of corporates being Tatas, Birlas, Infosys, or HDFC. That is a very rare species. The 63 million enterprises, most of them don't have credit. Most of them don't live very long. And that's where most of the employment is, or was at least. Mm-hmm. But it's important to recognize that unemployment is exactly in the range of where it was pre-COVID, which is exactly where it was for the last 40 years before COVID. Mm-hmm. So I keep coming back to that. It's between 6 and 9%. So unemployment is a poor or a useless metric to measure the health of the Indian labor markets, because between 6 and 9% since 1947, the problem is employed poverty. So even during COVID, people had jobs. They just didn't have those jobs paying the salaries that they wanted or they needed.
But, wasn't COVID supposed to throw up wasn't the crisis of COVID supposed to throw up the opportunities? And what are the new lessons we have learned to deal with, say, unemployment? You can't say that just because you've had 6 to 9% unemployment from 1947, that going forward, we haven't learned any lessons either.
But I think we have learned lessons. We have formalized India. The number of social security payers in the last 5 years is more than the 50 years before that. The foreign direct investment in the last 5 years is more than the 50 years before that. So I guess it depends on whether you're looking at health or performance, or whether you're looking at stock or flow. Both things are really important, right? So the notion that India's momentum has not gathered during COVID, and you can decide how you want to measure momentum. Will you measure momentum by amount of investment in the economy? Clearly way up. The confidence of foreigners in the economy? Clearly way up. The amount of salary growth in the formal sector, it's gone back. We have a sign outside our office now: trespassers will be recruited. Now you may say, well, you're a sampling error. You just you have 3 lakh employees. You only have hired 2 million, 20 lakh employees in the last 20 years. Sure, that's true. But we are a proxy for the Indian economy. We don't operate outside India. We are not the chef. So we can't find people. We can't find people in cities. Now, this question of how many cities in India are creating jobs at the rate that India needs? About 200. We have 6 lakh villages, 2 lakh of those have less than 200 people. I can't take jobs to people. You have to bring people to jobs. And I think that has happened. The number of migrants now is higher than it was 2 years ago. I remember 2 years ago, a big visual or framing in everybody's mind was the migrants walking home. But the interstate migrants are now 85 million, which is higher than what it was, 70 million, 2 years ago. So they went back home. They were not welcomed at home. They realized they were running away from economic wastelands, not running towards cities. Mm-hmm. So I think that interstate migrants are now up to 85 million is our estimate and calculation. Obviously, economists and surveys will come up in the next few years. But I don't think COVID has taught us the lesson that India will now live in its villages, which is what people thought would be the lesson from this. So I don't think COVID is.
So India will not live in its villages. The villages will come to the city. Is that one lesson?
I think so. I don't think we should shove everybody into Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore. So we should raise the number of cities which we have with more than 1 million people. So the biggest lesson of COVID is mega cities, which are people with more than 10 million, are a problem. But the sweet spot is somewhere between 1 and 3 million. So India only has 52 cities with more than 1 million people, and we have about 8 cities with close to 8 cities with more than 10 million people. But we need 200 cities with more than 1 million people, and we should bring our 6 lakh villages to 3 lakh, because you cannot take a hospital, you cannot take a school, and you definitely can't take a software development center to a village with less than 5 lakh people.
Okay, let's talk about the budget a little bit, and pre and post budget. Pre-budget, Air India finally has been sold. In fact, during the budget, the finance minister has signed the last check of 52,000 crores to complete that deal. Now there is talk of an IPO for LIC, which is the Life Insurance Corporation, by the end of the year. The DIPAM secretary has said that IDBI Bank will also be sold. What do you think are these symbolic in disinvestments? How do you look at them?
I think that it is just righting a historical wrong. It is. I mean, governments are incapable of running airlines or hotels. There's an old saying, "Jahan Raja Vyapari, Wahan Praja Bhikhari." Air India was bought for 2 crores. They put in 1.4 lakh crores over just the last 15 years. And this is not something surprising, right? I mean, there was a Hungarian economist in exactly the same year, Karnas, who said that public sector entities have an investment hunger because they never can go broke. They will always tend to make more losses. They will always offer. And since they usually don't have clients, they have hostages. Air India was a monopoly from 50 to the early 90s. And I think people focus on the losses, but I focus on the fact that Kanpur and Durgapur didn't get connected by air till as recently as 5 years ago. It should have happened. So the costs of the public sector are not just the losses. Obviously, the 20 crore loss a day as a headline number became it became easier to do Air India because people recognized the stupidity of that. But I think the bigger cost of public sector monopolies in the past was just India's development.
But, it seems, Mr. Sabharwal, that, despite what this DIPAM secretary, which is the Department of Investment and Public Asset Management, Tuhin Kanti Pandey, has told the Indian Express about IDBI Bank and a red herring prospectus for LIC, which is perhaps the prospectus that sort of gives you in detail what's going to be done for the LIC IPO. But the budget itself, if you read the fine print, there seems to be some hesitation about privatization. I mean, there's very little in the budget of the government's intentions to privatize further. So what is it? Do you think that the government is sort of, in half a mind about what to do next?
I think these are very difficult transactions to do. I mean, the amount of court cases, the amount of stuff that DIPAM had to do to get Air India done is just remarkable that they got that transaction off the line. Memory of doing privatization has been lost. The last privatization was 20 years ago. So none of the bureaucrats, none of the press people, none of the private, we don't have the memory of how to get these complex transactions done. So I think that there is a clear intention about 4 companies in the strategic sectors that was stated last year. We're on track for that with banks. We're obviously on track with that for many of the areas that are currently identified. Obviously, bank privatization is much more complex than an airline or a bread company or a steel company or even just, but we already have 59 listed companies and most of them, the government share is down to 51%. So I think privatization as distinct from being disinvestment or being listing is really about creating a voice of capital. I mean, the government is a core voice of capital in commercial entities. I think there's a clear intention and glide path. Obviously, these things take time, but
intention isn't that clear. That's
India.
No, I'm just sorry to interrupt you, but the intention isn't that clear. If you look at the budget, the word privatization doesn't even figure. I mean, it's been substituted by this phrase. Let me read it out to you. Strategic transfer of ownership or selection of strategic partners. I mean, you're wordifying, you're jargonizing language. Why can't you sort of simply come out and say that we want to privatize? Because as you said, the government has to get out of, especially loss-making PSUs.
I think the intention has been stated. And I think the fact that you get a strategic partner is very different from, listing 59 companies. SEBI never enforces its own laws on public sector entities. So listing a public entity, which is distributing your shares to the public, is not the same thing as selling Bhushan to Tatas or Air India to Tatas or selling an entity where you create voice of capital. So at least from my vantage point, for the first time in 20 years, we not only have a trophy transaction, we also have an important milestone with LIC next week. But over the next year or two, you will see a massive cleanup of the 360 public sector entities in the center. But also in response to this, there are 1,500 state government public sector entities. State finances have been ravaged by COVID. They depend on petrol, they depend on alcohol. All state governments are close to a real kadaki in their finances. So I think selling 1,500 state government PSUs is also on the agenda. So actually, I wouldn't read too much into this neglect. Because private, what you do is more loud. It doesn't matter what you say. And I think Air India as a transaction, LIC, the ISPAT, and even BPCL, which has been delayed. But there will be a lot more privatization than we have had in the last 20 years in the next 18 months.
So you believe that the government is willing to bite the bullet no matter what?
Well, I think Air India is a classic example. Finally, we have to give people credit for what they do. And there are very few people, even within government, who felt that you could get Air India over the line before the budget. I think it's a remarkable accomplishment. There were 4 court cases. You had to deal with Subramaniam Swamy. You had to deal with the Canadians. You had to deal with Antariksh. You had to deal with High Court of Chennai. It is just the amount of moving. There were 25 things that that could have gone wrong in the last 1 week, which were managed, which were dealt with for this transaction to happen. So I would say that let's pay attention to what they do rather than what they say.
Okay. Now the government has said that it will that there will be a 32% increase in market borrowings to finance its increased expenditure. Another element here is that the interest payments have already accounted for 19% of total government expenditure, and that is likely to go up to 22 and perhaps 24% as well by next year. So if 1/4 of your spending is interest payments, then there's something very wrong.
In what way is there something wrong? The biggest demand after a
quarter of your expenditure is going to just pay the debt that you have.
For most countries, it's between 18 and 25. So should we bring it down to 18? I think there's a fiscal glide path. I would submit that this government can't be criticized for being populistic and fiscally, irresponsible at the same time. We have to make up our mind. Is this government, does it have a tendency to be fiscally prudent, or does it have a tendency to be fiscally irresponsible? I don't know whether you can be both. I think that you need to, the ability to do what we have done in COVID came from the back of a 5-year fiscal consolidation before COVID. Before COVID, the fiscal deficits were coming down. There is a conscious decision that COVID is a one-time event. It's no longer an event, it's an era. It's lasted much longer than all of us thought it would be. And we discussed last time about the essence of strategy being optionality. So I think the fiscal consolidation between 2014 and 19 allowed us this 2-year window where we are busting the fisc. Fiscal government spending will be 39 lakh crores. And that is a substantial leap by any standards. But was it needed in a COVID year? When you're forcing lockdowns, when you're having, lockdowns were mandatory, companies had to shut down, people couldn't get to work. So I think for a COVID era, this 14%, I mean, America ran 25%, Japan ran 27% fiscal deficits through GDP. But I think there is a clear indication even within the budget, which is to not scrap the fiscal responsibility and glide path. I think that we could have gone much larger, but if fiscal deficits made countries rich, then no country would be poor. If monetary policy could make countries rich, then, I mean, I still haven't figured out whether monetary policy is a placebo or a painkiller or a steroid. So I think we have to be clear that fiscal and monetary policy are temporary fixes, but finally India's prosperity will be decided by the structural transformation, which I think is substantially on track. You know, a 10-year plan is not 10 one-year plans. Every entrepreneur knows that, whether you're a business entrepreneur and a political entrepreneur. And if you step back and look at the last 10 years, there is a structural transformation of farm to non-farm, rural to urban, subsistence self-employment to wage employment, informal to formal, and from school to work. So if I step back and I was a portfolio investor, I would say that the long-term trajectory of India is very different than what it was 5 years ago.
So what about the two Indias that Rahul Gandhi talks about? You know, in his speech in Parliament, he drives that point home again and again of there being two Indias, one being hurt very badly, and the other, which is, you know, both Indias are emerging from the pandemic, but one has been hurt much, much more badly. And that India, nobody is trying to help.
I'm not sure. What is the way to help that India? Is to do fiscal spending, is to skill India, is to educate India, is to urbanize India.
Not to cut Manrega funds. It's not to cut 25% of Manrega funds.
But they weren't utilized last year anyway, right? So even if the current allocation is higher than the utilization of last year, so nobody cuts funds. I think it's a it's economic illiteracy to suggest that funds which were not used for the last 3 years, when you equate actual funding with that, is cutting the funds. The Indian state's ability to spend its own budgets is quite challenged. There's a human capital challenge in the Indian state. We have 25 million civil servants. They would be the 50th largest country in the world. And we focus on 5,000 IAS officers, but there are 25 million civil servants. So let's be a little clear about this rickety state, which needs a lot of investment in human capital. So if spending or throwing money from helicopters could make India less poor, then I think we would have done it a long time ago. You know, there's a disease which historians warn against. It's called presentism. Richard Armitage is one of my favorite historians, you know, where today's circumstances are so special and so unique that you should drop everything and deal with today. I think I prefer Jonas Salk's, you know, he was the inventor of the polio vaccine. He said the most important question to ask yourself is, are you being a good ancestor?
Are you being a good ancestor?
Yes. I don't think we were good ancestors for the 40 economic ancestors for 30, 40 years after independence. I think we were great political ancestors. We have created the world's largest democracy on the infertile soil of the world's most hierarchical society. But we were stupid ancestors economically. We kneecapped the private sector. We built a public sector at the expense of spending money on primary education and healthcare. Essentially, today, our labor is handicapped without capital, and our capital is handicapped without labor. So if we want to be good ancestors, first, let's stop being breathless. A 10-year plan is not 10 one-year plans. Let's think about productivity. Let us think about the right level of government spending, but more importantly, let's think about where we should spend money more than how much money should get spent. Let's think about the right role of monetary policy in keeping inflation low rather than expecting RBI to solve India's poverty. So I would say that structurally, you know, the breathlessness of saying spend more money is really a dead end. We entered COVID with public debt to 70, 75%. We will exit COVID with 90, 95%. Now, if people believe that spending money is what we should do, we can get to 100, 110 without rocking the boat. Beyond 110 is when at least history suggests that you start having trouble in terms of credit ratings and everything else. But I don't think we're being good ancestors if we're going to be so narcissist to believe that our problems and we will make no sacrifices, and our problems are so special that we will borrow the hell out of the future, and our grandkids will pay for it.
But that's what we are
I
doing.
think
We are borrowing the hell out of the future. Your increase in market borrowings has gone up to 32%.
the percentage of GDP which central government debt is on the same trajectory if you do not believe that COVID is a one-time borrowing. I believe that COVID is the one-time borrowing. I believe that I'm not sure I would have borrowed as much as they did, but I think COVID being a one-time borrowing and a one-time adjustment to our finances is a globally accepted practice by everybody else. Now, 2 years ago, everybody was saying, well, if you don't do this, then you will be in trouble. So I think there was a halfway house. We could have borrowed 10 lakh crores. We borrowed 5 lakh crores extra. I think state governments are the ones which are going to have bigger trouble because they have not diversified their finances and done the stuff that is forced them. But I think COVID is a hearing aid or a mirror, whichever way you view it. India doesn't change for a better option. She changes when you have no option. And I think the central government's challenges are multiplied by 10 when you think about state government finances.
Okay.
So I'm glad that they'll do it now.
Okay, now let's talk a little bit about China. The import bill from China crossed $100 billion this year. I mean, over the last year. Of course, some of that expenditure, some of that must have gone into buying COVID-related equipment. But what is the message from this? You know, this sort of Atmanirbhar Arthvyavastha that the Prime Minister is talking about, or Atmanirbhar Bharat. Do you think that the two are contradictory? Because if you keep borrowing from China or buying from China, then your sort of import bill shoots up.
But it is specific, right? If you look at electronics, the PLI scheme has made a substantial difference to our imports from China. So I think obviously India's labor force of 11% in manufacturing is a sin. It should be 18, 19%. We'll never get to UK's 45, America's 28, or China's 23 peak. But I think that manufacturing being stuck at 11% since independence has been a challenge. I think if you look at 75% of the foreign direct investment in the last 10 years, it is in manufacturing. Make in India is becoming make for India. So I don't think these things change in one day. But the import bill from China is obviously important. The more important thing is the factory refugees from China, which are considering manufacturing in India. You know, Xi Jinping has made a list of everything that Deng Xiaoping did right, and he's crossing off each one of them. You know, foreign investors have lost $1.5 trillion in China in the last 18 months. So I think that I have watched with envy as China moves 700 million people from farms to non-farm employment. And that is why, even though our GDP per capita GDP was the same in the late 80s, today they are 5 times higher than us. But I think that this China opportunity, which is very real. I've had 5 or 10 Fortune 500 company boards ask me for an India update. I've had investment committees because everybody suddenly, I think there's something about getting to 3 trillion, 4 trillion in absolute GDP, which has emergent properties, you know, because now there's only Japan and Germany ahead of us, we'll cross them. So US is 24 trillion, China is 14 trillion. We're now going to be 5 trillion soon. We're already 3.5. So I think that the world is realizing that absolute GDP also has some characteristics for investments. Obviously, on a citizen's life, I think per capita GDP matters more. But I think from an investor's perspective, from an FDI perspective, the absolute size of India is getting to critical mass. So China's imports will continue. Obviously, there's many people who believe we should ban them. I think there should be a glide path. I think the glide path has worked well for us in terms of substitution. But I think saying that we'll ban Chinese imports would just stop the economies in ways that would not work.
But you're saying that the world is losing confidence in China?
I think so. I think that China, they held their nose with China's autocracy and in everything it did because it was a wonderful place to do business. If it's no longer a good place to do business, I think China's genius was moving from deals to rules. Now they are moving back from rules to deals. India's challenge has always been we didn't have enough rules. I think formalization, GST, I mean, a lot of what we've done in the last 5 years or 10 years is about moving from deals to rules.
Mhm.
I think we have made that, at least from an entrepreneur's perspective. I see that happen every day. There's still a long way to go with the 25 million civil servants and civil service
And
reform.
how does
But
pruning the
on a
bureaucracy, the 25 million bureaucracy, how does pruning that help?
Well, we don't need 75 ministries in Delhi. We don't need 200 people with the rank of Secretary to Government of India in Delhi. I mean, US has 14 ministries, Japan has 8, UK has 25 ministries. So I think that ease of doing business is also related to the structure of doing business, right? And so I don't think that what does the Ministry of Steel do? I mean, it doesn't do anything really. We don't need a Ministry of Steels in India. I mean, and there's so many energy ministries. So I would say that just like every organization every 10 years has to examine the appropriateness of its structure, I think that the steel frame has become a steel cage. I don't think we need to get rid of it, but it needs to be steel scaffolding. I think that the Indian civil service, as Nehru described it, was neither Indian nor civil nor a service. But Patel insisted on the steel frame. I think the steel frame was useful for the first 30, 40, 50 years. We were a nascent nation. We had complexities. But I think that steel frame has become a cage. And so civil service reform, the new capacity building commission is a wonderful initiative to sort of think about how to build capacity, how to improve performance management. And I hope that they get the mandate that the other administrative reform commissions didn't get. And it seems like India is ready for civil service reform, not defining civil service reform as IAS reform, but 25 million civil servants.
Okay, last couple of questions, Mr. Sabharwal. The first one, I just want to come back to China. Now, would you say 1 year down the line, when India did not join the China-led RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is, as you know, this 15-nation trading bloc, do you think in retrospect that was a good thing to do or not?
Absolutely. I mean, China is not a friend. I mean, China doesn't have any friends, of course. The only allies are probably North Korea or somebody like that. But I think that it's important to recognize that China considers India as a threat. And I think we have, obviously, as you mentioned, we have a huge bunch of imports from them. We used to get a bunch of unicorn money from them. We haven't got any unicorn money in the last 18 months, which has been substituted by other money. So I think that we have to treat India and Pakistan have relationship which is one of history and enmity, which needs to be resolved in different ways. But India and China's rivalry is for the next century. I mean, this is about who they have 50% of military spending in Asia is now China. Obviously they are powerful because they have a 14 trillion GDP. So I think India has to be careful in dealing with China. We have to use every tool in our kit to deal with China. And I think it will be a defining relationship for us economically, politically, and security-wise in the next 25 years.
Okay, so to come back to my last question and to come back to the interview that we did 2 years ago and what I said at the beginning of this interview, in which you said that COVID-19, this is your 2-year-old interview, in which you said COVID-19 is India's opportunity to get its act together and undertake overdue radical reform as China's brand is damaged. You still agree with that?
Absolutely. I think that the acceleration of FDI, see, everybody thinks that India doesn't have money. In the last 2 years, that's not true. Foreigners are throwing money at India. I mean, foreign direct investment is happening in India. So if the binding constraint was India was not land, you could give every Indian household half an acre, we'd fit in Rajasthan. It's not labor. 40% of our labor force is Vela. If the binding constraint was capital, well, COVID-19 has got rid of that binding constraint. But there's a fourth factor of production called entrepreneurship or innovation. And I think that is the fourth factor of production that has really accelerated in India in the last 2 years. And COVID has laid the foundations for our global soft power. Software employment is going from 5 million to 10 million, and that is a real source of soft power. But more importantly, the domestic consumption economy that COVID has bred will only substantially accelerate after COVID.
But this domestic consumption economy that you're talking about, do you think that as we emerge, as India emerges from COVID, hopefully, that the money at the bottom of the pyramid will stimulate demand? Because there's been a lot of criticism of this budget that you haven't put money into the hands of the poor at the bottom of that pyramid, and that will not stimulate demand.
But budgets don't put money in the hands of the poor, jobs do. So I don't know when this became a notion that budgets put money in the hands of the poor. Work puts money in the hands of the poor. Well-paid work puts money in the hands of the poor. Well-paid work is created by firms. Firms need capital. Firms need ease of doing business. Firms need an education system that delivers workers that work. So, this Diet Coke approach to development, we want the taste without the calories. It doesn't exist. There is no Diet Coke approach to development. Development is about building human capital, building productive cities, building productive firms, and making it easy for first-generation entrepreneurs to raise money, to build companies, and to hire people at well-paying jobs. If anything, we can say that has improved in the last 2 to 5 years. Now, has that improved for 5 million people to start with? No, it has improved for 50 million people. Do we need it to improve for 500 million people? Absolutely. But the only way to get to 500 million is through 50 million.
Okay, and the other comment that you made in your interview 2 years ago, which again I reiterated at the beginning of this one, is that the pain after COVID will be unlikely anything we have seen before. Do you still stick with that?
No, I think that I misunderestimated the net calculation. I was looking at the gross calculation. Of course, there was a lot of pain, but much of the pain was blunted by technology. I didn't think vaccines would be available in 12 months. I think that's a remarkable innovation which the human race hasn't seen before. I miss the level of digitization and the adoption of digital technologies by non-digitally literate people, which has also been a blunting influence. So as I said, as with most things in life, you have to make a net calculation. It is the best of times, worst of times. It is agony, ecstasy. But on a net calculation for the country's structural abilities, COVID has brought out, obviously, a lot of public sector strength in it. And obviously, we are now ready for the next phase of the private sector.
On this note, Manish Sabharwal, on agony and ecstasy of India's problems and opportunities, thank you so much for speaking to me at ThePrint.
Thanks, Jyoti.